Okay, so this is our class for April 29th. This is our open day, and you all voted, and what came out on top was qualitative research. So this is a good topic. This is oftentimes overlooked by in experimental psych programs, and honestly, a lot of psychology programs overlook qualitative research. I think we focus so much on quantitative research that we kind of don't focus on it enough, and sometimes qualitative research gets a bad rap. So it's good to talk about this, and this will be a good topic. I think some people, your research topics may actually be able to use this qualitative approach. So we'll get to learn about this. So what we're going to do for this class is I'm going to be posting videos. I'm going to have this broken up into two sections, make it a little easier for me to record and for you to watch. But what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little time talking about the goals of qualitative research and kind of give a comparison of qualitative and quantitative research. They are very different from each other in their focuses and their methods, so it's good to kind of lay those out. And then we're going to talk about the process of conducting a qualitative study. So, to begin, why would we want to do qualitative research? So, the main goal of qualitative research is we really want to dive in and get a very rich understanding of how people experience some sort of phenomenon. Whatever your research question is, whatever the research topic is, we really just want to dive in and get information about things like, the lived experience, the context, basically like all those good, rich details about a person's actual psychological experiences. Basically, we're getting information about like the human side of an issue, things like people's behaviors, their beliefs and opinions, their feelings, the relationships they have, and so on. But importantly, this is very different than quantitative research because, of course, we can measure all these things in a quantitative perspective. But one of the problems that we sometimes run into in psychology is that when we use the quantitative approach, when we take something like feelings or beliefs and we kind of boil it down into just like a self-reported measure and change those beliefs into numbers, we sometimes worry that we're kind of missing out on a lot of stuff. And sometimes what we see is that when we're interested in a particular psychological phenomenon, the best way to understand it is just simply ask the person about it and listen to what they have to say and kind of get their unique perspective on what they're going through. This is also very common once you start kind of tipping over more into the realm of sociology. This is very common in sociology, anthropology. This is very good at identifying some like of these unmeasurable type of things or overlooked factors or just things that don't really boil down well into scales and measures and numbers. So this is things like it can capture ideas about social norms, things that somebody who's not part of a group or a culture might know to measure. Things like socioeconomic status. Again, we can measure this, but sometimes we miss a lot of those rich details about having a certain socioeconomic status and how that might affect people's lives. Gender roles, culture, race, ethnicity, religion, all these things. Again, we can measure these with our demographics and stuff, but we're missing a lot of those rich details. We're missing a lot of the kind of unique influences that these things have on people's lives. And qualitative research does a really good job of sitting down with people and kind of exploring some of these things. So this is the main goal. This is the reason why you might want to do the qualitative research. So just as an example, I would like to just quickly go over two papers to kind of compare and contrast the idea of qualitative versus quantitative. So both of these are on Brightspace if you'd like to read them. The Eaton et al. Paper, honestly, it's probably not necessary. This is a paper that was looking at kind of among other things, examining barriers to seeking mental health care in military spouses. And the approach that this took was it was a descriptive quantitative research. They basically surveyed a bunch of military spouses, and of the people they surveyed, a portion of them had experienced mental health issues. An even smaller subset were like officially diagnosed using pretty strict criteria of actually, having a mental health disorder. And then they asked them questions about things like what barriers are there to seeking mental health care, and they document the rate of endorsement for those problems. Again, probably not super mandatory unless you're interested in the topic and kind of want to see how they did it. The Cole et al. Paper, I would encourage you to read this, especially if you are interested in the topic or if you are interested in qualitative research. This paper actually does a really fantastic job of conducting a qualitative study, and it'll hit a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in class. It's also just plain interesting to understand and kind of read what they found. But it's basically they were looking at the same question. They were looking at perceptions of barriers to seeking mental health treatment among in military spouses. They asked a few other things as well, but that was one of the topics. And they used the qualitative research approach by interviewing military spouses. In this case, it was all wives and heterosexual relationships. And they asked them questions about these barriers and listened to what they had to say. So if we compare the two papers, for the Eaton et al. Paper, they looked at the rates of barriers to care. So they had about 74 people who met that strict criteria for actually being diagnosed with things like major depression or anxiety disorder. And then they have the different rates of the barriers to care and perceptions of stigma. So if you look at the table, you see that about 1/5 to 1/4 endorsed all these options as something that prevents them from getting uh, a care. So just not knowing where to get help, having difficulty scheduling appointments. About 43% say that it's difficult to get time off work or getting childcare in order to get treatment, or it costs too much money. In terms of stigma, being too embarrassing, it would harm my spouse's career, or I would be seen as weak. So let's focus on one of these. So let's talk about barriers to care. Um, so I would recommend just pause for a second here. So you see this, you see it's difficult to schedule an appointment. Maybe think, you're reading the stat. What are you thinking? What does difficulty to schedule an appointment mean to you? And like, what will you do with that information? So just take a second to think about that. I think for me, I would interpret this as like it's just like difficult to find providers. It's hard to schedule an appointment, hard to call, hard to find a time, hard to find availability. But if we look at the Cole paper, we get a lot more information about how the military spouses are thinking about this idea of it being difficult to schedule an appointment. So in the Cole et al. Paper, how they do their study, they interview people and then they describe the responses and kind of organize it into themes. And one person, when talking about the difficulties in scheduling an appointment, they say the reality is that the military can't guarantee that the local community and local providers will be able to provide everything we need when we need it. Okay, that makes sense. That's kind of similar to what we see over here. Another person then adds, TRICARE can sometimes be a pain when you're trying to schedule something, and it will make you schedule at 6 weeks out because that's what's first available. So I don't know if any of you grew up military or have any military experience, but for those of you not, TRICARE is the like military health insurance. I know every time I've talked about this paper in a class that had somebody with military background and knew TRICARE, it would always be followed by like a 5-minute rant about, let me tell you about TRICARE. So this is something that maybe wouldn't have come up from that Eaton paper of just saying it's difficult to schedule an appointment, is that specifically the insurance is a pain. That this specific insurance that's for active duty military and their family can prevent you and cause an extra headache for trying to schedule care. Another person adds to that, if it's taking a long time to schedule because that's what's first available, you hope that you get an appointment and you just hope that you can jive with whoever called because you have to wait another month or two if you have to try to find something else. So that's another layer. Sometimes there's so many different approaches to therapy and different ways of doing things, and that bond with the therapist is a super important piece. So if you have to wait 6 months to schedule and they kind of don't fit your needs or you don't like them, you have to wait another 6 months to go find another person. And so that's another very rich detail, an interesting detail about that difficulty in scheduling an appointment. And then also they mentioned, this is something that's discussed in earlier in the paper, is that one of the big challenges for mental health and military spouses is that you're frequently moving around, and that creates so many challenges. What they also bring it up here is that, not only does it take a long time, and maybe you just have to hope that you like your therapist that you get matched up with. But then, even if you do, you might, as soon as you get a good therapist and things are going well, then your spouse gets deployed to a new location and you have to move and you have to start from scratch. So, all of this is not necessarily what I would grab from this little one line text. So you can kind of see the benefits here and what qualitative research is trying to do. It's trying to get a lot more depth. It's trying to get a lot more information. It's trying to get a lot more of that lived detail that might be missed by just, a simple, it's difficult to schedule an appointment. The answer is yes or no. You basically don't get that rich detail from that. Let's have another example. Let's look at the stigma. So here they talk about, it's too embarrassing. It would harm my spouse's career. I would be seen as weak. Maybe seems pretty straightforward. Being embarrassing and seen as weak are like, common stereotypes. And I think people could understand that. But if we look at Cole et al., what the military spouses that they interviewed are saying, one person says, I've been told by other spouses not to go out, hang out with her. This person being somebody who had gone to therapy. I've been told not to hang out with her in group settings because she's crazy. And you can imagine, if your friends, your community are telling you don't hang out with other people who have gone to therapy, you're probably not going to be super likely to want to rush out to therapy yourself. Another person mentioned, if you answer honestly, you're sometimes like, they're going to put me in a padded room if I really tell you what my last 2 weeks have been like. So there's pressure there. In terms of not harming my spouse's career, this is one that I'm assuming that maybe if you're in the military, you kind of understand, but for people who are outside the military, there's some detail that's being missed in this simple sentence, but people elaborate in the Cole paper. People keep it quiet because they don't want their spouse, their military member, to not get promoted or not get more responsibility and stuff like that because they're not keeping it together. And another person adds to that, you don't want to hurt your husband's career, and that's what you've heard for a long time. He looks like he can't handle the situation at home. So I think this is a really good example of how doing the qualitative data gets at like the culture that especially somebody who's outside of the military might not really understand. He looks like he can't handle the situation at home is obviously not how mental health works, and that's not what you should do. But apparently there's this like culture and this thought that if your wife's depressed, that means that you're not a good husband, so we can't promote you into a leadership role. If that's the culture, if that's what you've heard for a long time, you don't want to put your husband's job at risk by potentially looking like your relationship isn't strong, or you're not keeping it together at home. So kind of interesting elaboration on what is here in this quantitative paper. The last one to mention is, I'd be seen as weak. Again, this one kind of makes sense. It's, a common stereotype of, a reason why people sometimes don't seek mental health is because they think that, having mental health issues or going to therapy makes them seem weak. But in the Cole paper, we see a little bit of elaboration on that. One thing, and you can read more about this, I could have highlighted more, but one thing that came up a lot in the discussions about mental health and military spouses is that the spouses are under a ton of stress. They're constantly moving. This move can create like a bit of a loss of identity. There's always, the fear for the spouse. But the struggle is, their spouse is working such a high stress job that this the military member is working such a high stress job that the military spouse, in this case the wife, kind of feels like they have to be strong, they have to be the rock, they have to hold everything together. And also, they have a lot of invalidation of their feelings. Like, if you're stressed out about your email job and your husband is out in combat duty, like, you know, am I valid to be anxious over that? And some people feel like not. So one person says, spouses consider themselves less worthy of getting treatment, or that their problems just aren't as important, comparing themselves to their spouse who's working such a high stress job. They also mentioned that, it's always the case too that someone always has it worse. So if you're depressed over, your husband being gone away, well, there's probably somebody who their husband's been gone for a lot longer, or, people who have spouses who have died, or, if you're stressed out about the, 3 moves that you've done in the past 2 years, there's probably somebody who's done a lot more of that. So basically, it's not just like the stereotype of mental illness and weakness, but also this, again, that culture of the expectation that you have to be strong, or that, you can't complain because other people have it worse than you. And so complaining is actually, that's weakness. And your problems just aren't worthy of, not rising to the level where you should need treatment. So again, I hope this is a good illustration of the kind of goal of qualitative research, and how it can really help expand on some of the maybe more simplistic quantitative research, where we're kind of taking a very complex topic and kind of boiling it down into numbers. So just kind of as a summary of the qualitative versus quantitative, we definitely see a lot of differences here. They can be very, very different. If you're trained in quantitative research, sometimes honestly we can be a little bit biased on, what is preferable. But I would just emphasize that, these are different because they have different goals. It's not necessarily that one is better than the other. It's just really, choosing the research method that's best for your particular research question. So for qualitative data, the goals are usually to really gain that rich, complex understanding. Oftentimes, too, you're trying to develop hypotheses, you're trying to develop theories, and kind of it's a very bottom-up approach. So you're taking these interviews, you're taking this information, kind of building the hypothesis or the theory from the ground up. Quantitative data, on the other hand, is trying to test hypotheses. It's like more top down. You start with a theory, you start with an idea of what's happened, and then you test to see whether or not that's accurate or not. And the goal of quantitative data is usually to make really broad generalizations. So we kind of average across everyone's experiences. We recognize that, like, hey, not everyone will show a particular phenomenon, but that's okay. We're just trying to kind of make sense of what typically happens. What are people typically like? What behaviors do we typically do? What type of feelings, what type of thoughts do we typically have? And so we're not necessarily interested in that, like, very rich, complex understanding. We're more interested in, like, trying to figure out what generally happens. So 2 very different goals here. The methods are also very different. In qualitative research, oftentimes we're focusing on a very small sample. So if we're trying to get that rich, complex understanding, we almost have to keep a small sample, because the more people you add, the harder it is to do, basically, and the more likely it is that you kind of gloss over something important. So the goal usually is to keep a small sample. Participants and researchers are very heavily involved in the research. And I guess I should say the participants in research are they interact quite a bit. In quantitative data, usually we see very minimal interaction between the participant and the research. Honestly, best practice is to basically have as little contact between the researcher and participant as possible. Whereas for qualitative data, oftentimes the researchers and the participants are very much entangled, and we kind of just have to expect that there's going to be some back and forth influence with qualitative data. Also, in qualitative data, control is not a priority at all. It's very much just, let things happen how they happen. We're not gonna, emphasize that nice laboratory type of experiment, whereas we oftentimes do with quantitative data. We want to control all extraneous factors. We want to control any confounds. We want to make sure that, it's the when we test a hypothesis that we're getting the clearest answer about whether the hypothesis is supported or not. In terms of data, we see a lot of differences as well. Obviously, qualitative data is qualitative, and quantitative data is numbers. So very, very different. The data tends to be more about like categorization, oftentimes thinking about like themes and what's emerging from the data. Um, it's also very iterative too. So like as new stuff is coming in, you're kind of changing categories and expanding and always kind of revising as you go. The data collection is usually semi-structured. It depends on what you're doing. Some of it can be more structured, some of it can be less structured, but usually it's semi-structured. It can kind of there's like a plan going in, but it's open, it's flexible to basically go wherever the participants lead it. Um, the data is usually textual, so interviews, audio, visual, analyzing documents, things like that. And the data usually describe individual experiences, potentially like group norms and stuff. But again, it's that very rich, what is your lived experience? What is your context? What is your life, basically? That's contrasted with quantitative data, which is usually pretty rigid categorization. You know, when you would measure your data using the scales that you chose for your proposal, you get particular numbers. There's a particular way of scoring it. You can't just, go off script and be like, well, I'm going to do it differently. Because if you do it differently, then it may be no good. Data collection is usually highly structured. Data are always numerical. And the goal with the data are to kind of describe, quantify, predict population level phenomena. It's very, very inferential, rather than looking at the individual experiences. So again, these are very, very different. I would say the biggest difference is that qualitative research is super flexible and focused on the individual. Basically, participants kind of determine what happens next with the research question, and the research questions might shift based on what's learned. This can be very challenging if you are not familiar with qualitative research. I know, like back in my graduate days, I think with my quantitative training, I would oftentimes be a little biased. Like, I think if I read the Cole et al. Paper back in my graduate day, I would be like, oh, cool, you interviewed 10 people. Neat, great. But I've definitely grown to appreciate that, it's not necessarily the case. I know some people oftentimes will confuse the flexibility of qualitative data for like less scientific rigor, but I've definitely grown to appreciate that they're different because they have different purposes. You might look at the small samples of qualitative research and be like, well, um, how's that going to generalize? We learn so much in this research methods class of like, well, you want to be able to, have larger samples so they generalize to the population better. There's less sampling error, more likely to get significant results. However, our goal is not to test hypotheses. The goal is to gain the rich, complex understanding, and that's why we have small samples. Same thing for control. We emphasized how to have good internal validity in this class, but we don't care about that because again, we're not testing hypotheses. We're not trying to make broad generalizations. We're just trying to see what people's lives are like. So this is kind of an illustration of how quantitative and qualitative can be different. Quantitative research is, our classic scientific method. You start with a research question, you develop background knowledge, and that helps you come up with a hypothesis. Then you collect your data, you analyze your results, and then interpret it. And then potentially you interpret those results and it goes back to a new question or a new hypothesis and you start fresh. Qualitative research mixes up the order. We start with a research question, we do our background knowledge, and then we collect our data. So you can see it's a little different here. I think in terms of like, all our p hacking, we always say, oh, you always have to come up with the hypothesis first. Not so in qualitative research, because again, the goal is honestly to come up with a hypothesis. So we collect our data, then we analyze our results, and this is oftentimes iterative. So after you analyze your results, do you go back and maybe change your interview, or you change the questions that you're asking, you collect more data, keep analyzing the results until you come up with a theory, a hypothesis, a set of themes, and then sometimes that goes back to collecting more data and kind of revising what you're doing. And so it goes iteratively until you get to the point where you're ready to interpret your results. So very, very different. And again, if you're not familiar with qualitative research, it can be a bit of a culture shock in a way, and it can be hard to realize that there is still validity in doing it this way, because again, we have different goals than with quantitative research. All right, last thing I want to wrap up for this little section is just some kind of quotes and summary of the main ideas behind qualitative research. One person, Patton 2002, says qualitative research seems to work best for people with high tolerance of ambiguity. Tracy 2010, which is a very classic one on best practices in qualitative data, says that qualitative methodology is as much art as it is effort, piles of data, and time in the field. So flexibility is emphasized over standardized practices. Subjectivity is embraced. Instead of reliability and validity, oftentimes we focus more on credibility. And we will get to talk more about this in the next section. But just to wrap up, again, this can be kind of tricky for people who are trained in the quantitative approach, but it is still a very valid approach, and it works very well for certain types of questions. So we will pick up talking about how to conduct a qualitative research project in the next in the next video.